The Vampire King watched Marina's fingers dance across the keys, night after night, until she played the one song that could break his ancient curse. The music stopped mid-phrase when she sensed his presence. What neither of them knew, her next decision would determine whether the empty concert hall became their sanctuary or their tomb. Marina Blackwood's fingers found their way to the familiar ebony and ivory keys as the clock tower struck midnight, the sound echoing through the empty streets like a funeral bell. The celestial concert hall stretched around her in perfect darkness, its gilded walls and crystal chandeliers invisible to her sightless eyes, but she knew every inch of this abandoned palace from the way sound bounced off its surfaces. 3 months had passed since her dismissal from the Metropolitan Opera House. 3 months of rejections and closed doors, 3 months of playing to ghosts in this forgotten sanctuary where no one could judge her for feeling too deeply. Tonight carried something different in the air, a metallic tang that made her skin prickle with awareness. The silence felt heavier than usual, weighted with presence rather than emptiness. She began with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced grace. But something pulled her away from the familiar melody into uncharted territory. The music that flowed from her hands came from a place beyond memory, ancient and mournful, each note seeming to carry centuries of longing and loss. She had never learned this song, never heard it played, yet her fingers knew every phrase with impossible certainty. From the shadows at the back of the hall, Adrian Drackle watched with growing amazement as the mortal woman played the one melody that could reach into the darkest corners of his cursed soul. 17 nights he had lingered here, drawn by her extraordinary talent, but tonight she played Alara's Lament, the lullaby his mortal wife had sung 3 centuries ago before death claimed her. The Vampire King felt something stirring in his chest that he had thought dead forever, not the familiar gnawing hunger that drove him through endless nights, but recognition of a kindred spirit calling across the void of time. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel, and comment where you are watching from, and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Marina's hands stilled mid-phrase as the sound of deliberate footsteps echoed through the vast space, each step measured and careful. Her head turned toward the approaching presence, her unseeing eyes focused on the darkness with laser intensity. The breathing she had sensed earlier grew closer, carrying with it that strange metallic scent that seemed to coat the back of her throat. Her voice remained steady despite the rapid beating of her heart as she spoke into the shadows. "I know someone's there." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge and an invitation. Adrian froze at the edge of the stage lights, centuries of predatory instincts warring with an unfamiliar desire for connection. He had not spoken to a mortal in decades, had not allowed himself to be discovered by one who might live to remember the encounter. Yet something about this blind pianist called to the remnants of his humanity with irresistible force. His voice emerged from the darkness, rough with disuse but carrying the weight of infinite loneliness and an accent that belonged to no living nation. "Don't stop playing." Marina's fingers hovered over the keys as she processed the timbre of his voice, the way it seemed to resonate with something deeper than sound. "Who are you?" The question drifted between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Adrian found himself moving closer, his footsteps echoing in the vast empty hall with a hollow ring that spoke of spaces too large for human comfort. Each step brought him deeper into dangerous territory, closer to breaking rules he had followed for 3 centuries. "Someone who remembers that song," he admitted, the words torn from him against his better judgment. Marina sensed the otherworldly quality that clung to him like a second skin, the absence of warmth that should have surrounded a living body, the way sound seemed to bend and distort in his presence. She pressed a single key, the note hanging pure and clear in the space between them like a test of truth. "How do you know it? I've never heard it before tonight." Her fingers trembled slightly as they rested on the keys, waiting for an answer that might change everything. Adrian's hands clenched at his sides as he wrestled with the impossible choice between truth and safety, between the loneliness that had consumed him for 3 centuries and the connection that beckoned like salvation. The conversation that followed became a delicate dance of revelation and concealment, each word chosen with the care of a surgeon's blade. Adrian spoke of listening to her play for weeks, drawn by the peace her music brought to his tormented existence, though he could not explain the nature of that torment without revealing truths that would damn them both. Marina challenged his presence here, questioning what manner of person haunted abandoned buildings in the depths of night, her sharp intelligence cutting through his careful evasions like light through shadow. He deflected with mentions of a rare condition that made daylight impossible, a medical explanation that carried enough truth to satisfy her immediate curiosity while hiding the monstrous reality beneath. As their words wove between them, Marina began to recognize in this stranger's voice the same bone-deep loneliness that had driven her to seek solace in empty halls and midnight melodies. The isolation that her blindness created in a world designed for the sighted seemed to echo in his carefully modulated tones, and she found herself offering something she had not given another soul in years. "Would you like to meet again tomorrow night?" The invitation surprised them both with its boldness. Adrian felt the weight of 3 centuries of self-imposed exile pressing against his chest as he considered the implications of accepting. Every instinct screamed warnings about the danger he posed to any mortal who grew close to him, yet the prospect of another evening in her company pulled at him with gravitational force. "Yes," he said simply, knowing he was crossing a line he had sworn never to breach again. As Marina gathered her few belongings and folded her white cane with practiced efficiency, she turned back toward where she sensed him standing. "I'm Marina," she said, the name offered like a gift. "Adrian," he replied, the syllables feeling strange on his tongue after so long unused in introduction. The exchange felt heavier than simple courtesy, like a vow neither had intended to make, but both would honor. He watched from the shadows as she made her way toward the exit, her movements confident despite her blindness, white cane sweeping in practiced arcs as she navigated the moonlit streets beyond. Adrian remained motionless, long after her footsteps faded into the distance, already counting the hours until midnight would bring her back to him. Already anticipating tomorrow night, with an emotion he had forgotten he could feel. Hope burned in his chest like a flame he thought extinguished forever, dangerous and beautiful and utterly forbidden. The Vampire King had found something worth risking everything to protect, and that knowledge terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. As dawn approached and forced him back to the shadows of his underground lair, Adrian carried with him the memory of Marina's music and the impossible promise of connection with a mortal soul who played the song of his long-dead wife as if she had written it herself. Marina arrived the following night, carrying a leather satchel filled with sheet music transcribed in Braille and a thermos of chamomile tea that steamed in the cold air like incense. The ritual they established felt as natural as breathing, she playing while he listened from the shadows, then conversation during her breaks when her fingers needed rest. Adrian appeared at the stroke of midnight with clockwork precision, his presence announced by the subtle shift in air pressure that her heightened senses had learned to recognize. Their talks revealed depths neither had expected to find in a stranger met in darkness. Marina discovered that Adrian possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of classical music that spanned centuries, from Baroque masters to Romantic composers to modern experimentalists. Knowledge he deflected with explanations of intensive academic study and a lifelong passion for musical history. Adrian learned that Marina had lost her sight at age 12 to a genetic condition that slowly dimmed her world until only music remained clear. But rather than destroying her dreams, blindness had sharpened her other senses until she could hear emotions in every note and feel the heartbeat of a composition through her fingertips. She had been dismissed from the Metropolitan Opera House not for any lack of technical skill, but for playing with what the board called excessive emotion during a high-stakes donor event. her interpretation of Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23, moving several wealthy patrons to tears in a way that apparently made them uncomfortable. Adrian recognized the bitter irony that her emotional depth, the very quality that had cost her professional standing, was exactly what drew him to her music like a moth to flame. Their conversations circled around parallel forms of isolation, Marina explaining how her blindness created invisible barriers with sighted people who either treated her like fragile glass or inspirational decoration, while Adrian spoke carefully of his own separation from others, the way immortality created unbridgeable distances from mortals, though he could never explain the true nature of that gulf. Neither revealed their deepest truth yet, but both sensed the careful construction of walls that protected secrets too dangerous to share. The delicate balance they had built began to crack during their fifth meeting when Marina chose to play a piece she had discovered in an old collection, a haunting composition in a minor key that seemed to pulse with primal rhythms. The moment her fingers found the opening chords, Adrian felt something violent stir in the depths of his cursed nature, recognition blazing through him like wildfire. The melody resembled too closely the ritual chants he remembered from darker centuries, blood songs that had once accompanied ceremonies he tried desperately to forget. His predatory instincts surged forward with terrifying intensity, fangs extending involuntarily as the beast within him responded to music that spoke of sacrifice and ancient hungers. He fled without explanation, claiming sudden illness as he vanished into the night, leaving Marina alone at the piano with her hands frozen above the keys and confusion written across her face. The next night brought only empty silence when midnight struck and Adrian failed to appear. Marina waited until the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the hall's grimy windows, playing every piece she could remember in hopes of calling him back, her music growing increasingly desperate as hours passed without any sign of his presence. From a distant rooftop 3 blocks away, Adrian perched like a gargoyle among the Gothic spires, fighting the war between his nature and his growing attachment to the mortal woman whose music called to something beyond his curse. Her melodies drifted to him on the night wind, each note a blade of longing that cut deeper than any physical wound he had ever endured. On the third night of his absence, Marina finally confronted the empty hall directly, her voice echoing off marble walls as she spoke to shadows that might or might not contain the man she had begun to care for more than wisdom suggested. "I know you're out there. Whatever I did wrong, just tell me." The words cracked with pain that made Adrian's dead heart clench in his chest. He materialized from the darkness like a specter of guilt, his face drawn with 3 days of internal torment. "You did nothing wrong. I'm the problem." The admission hung between them like a confession before an altar, and Marina's relief at his return quickly transformed into anger at his abandonment. Their first real argument erupted across the empty space, Marina demanding honesty while Adrian struggled with the impossible balance between truth and protection, between his need for her company and his terror of what his nature might do to destroy the only beautiful thing left in his cursed existence. The confrontation forced Adrian to begin peeling back layers of deception he had maintained for centuries, revealing fragments of truth like shards of broken glass that caught the moonlight streaming through stained windows. He admitted to being far older than his appearance suggested, speaking of decades and centuries as if they were merely extended seasons in a life that had stretched beyond normal human comprehension. He confessed to losing everyone he had ever allowed himself to care about, though he framed these losses in terms of natural death and the passage of time rather than the supernatural curse that had claimed them all. Getting close to people, he explained with voice heavy with accumulated grief, seemed to bring them nothing but pain and early graves, as if he carried some invisible plague that destroyed everything beautiful in his vicinity. Marina countered his self-imposed isolation with her own catalog of vulnerabilities, explaining how the sighted world treated her blindness as either inspiration pornography or pitiful burden, rarely allowing her to exist simply as Marina without the qualifier of her disability. She played for him then, a composition she had written during her darkest period after losing her opera position, a piece that captured the essence of loneliness so perfectly that Adrian felt his centuries of solitude reflected in every phrase. The music spoke of empty rooms and silent phones, of conversations that never quite connected and touches that never quite reached across the void between souls. Adrian realized that this mortal woman understood isolation in ways that even his immortal acquaintances, wrapped in their own forms of eternal separation, had never grasped. Gradually, carefully, he began to speak of Ilara, describing her as someone precious he had lost long ago to illness, a woman whose memory he carried like a sacred flame, though he could not bring himself to mention that she had been his wife, or that he had carried her ghost in his heart for 3 full centuries. When Marina played Alara's lament again, this time with the conscious knowledge that it meant something profound to her mysterious companion, Adrian found himself singing along in the ancient dialect his mortal wife had used, his voice weaving around Marina's melody like smoke around candlelight. The harmony they created together transcended mere music, becoming something that seemed to reshape the very air around them. Not quite love yet, but recognition of souls that had found their match across impossible distances of time and circumstance. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of empty seats and the weight of centuries, both Adrian and Marina understood that they had crossed into territory from which there might be no safe return, but neither possessed the strength or desire to retreat from the connection that blazed between them like a star being born in the darkness of space. The ancient catacombs beneath the city stirred with whispered conversations and the rustle of silk against stone as the vampire council convened in their underground palace, a Gothic cathedral carved from living rock where shadows danced with malevolent life, and the air itself seemed to pulse with centuries of accumulated power. Countess Elisabetta Bathory presided from her obsidian throne, her porcelain features unchanged since the 16th century, when she had first tasted immortal blood. Her crimson eyes scanning the assembled vampires with the calculating coldness of a predator evaluating prey. Adrian Drackle stood before the council like a defendant awaiting judgment, his absence from court gatherings and neglect of traditional feeding grounds having drawn unwanted attention from those who monitored the ancient laws that governed their kind. The summons had arrived carved into his sanctuary wall in letters that burned with supernatural fire, a message that could not be ignored without declaring open rebellion against the authority that had ruled vampire society for over a millennium. Elisavetta's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as she questioned Adrian's recent behavior, her tone suggesting she already possessed answers to the questions she posed with theatrical precision. Adrian deflected with carefully constructed lies, claiming to have discovered new hunting territories in the city's expanding districts, territories that required careful cultivation and observation before they could be properly harvested. His explanations rang hollow in the echoing chamber, particularly when Elisavetta's spy network had already documented his nightly visits to the abandoned concert hall and his failure to feed from any mortal source in over a month. The council operated according to laws written in blood and enforced with merciless efficiency, laws that demanded absolute secrecy and the immediate elimination of any threat to vampire survival. Any mortal who discovered their true nature faced 3 possibilities: transformation into one of their kind, immediate death, or complete memory erasure that left them as empty shells of their former selves. Elisaveta delivered her ultimatum with the casual indifference of someone ordering wine, her words carrying the force of divine commandment in the supernatural hierarchy. Adrian must end his association with the mortal immediately, or face judgment that would result in his destruction and the obliteration of everything he had tried to protect. The ancient vampire felt the weight of 3 centuries pressing against his chest as he bowed his submission, knowing that defiance would bring swift and terrible retribution not just upon himself, but upon Marina, whose only crime had been showing kindness to a monster masquerading as a man. While Adrian faced the council's interrogation, Marina found herself plagued by dreams unlike anything she had experienced in her 28 years of life, visions that came with the clarity of memory, despite depicting places and people she had never encountered in waking hours. Night after night, her sleeping mind filled with images of a woman whose face remained tantalizingly out of focus, dark hair cascading around shoulders, clothed in fabrics that belonged to centuries past. The dream woman played piano in a candlelit room that seemed to exist outside normal time, her fingers dancing across keys that produced melodies Marina recognized with bone-deep certainty, though she had never learned them from any earthly teacher. These nocturnal visions carried emotional weight that lingered long after consciousness returned, leaving Marina with the unsettling sensation that she was remembering rather than imagining, that some part of her soul had touched something ancient and profound beyond the boundaries of her current existence. The music in these dreams always centered around Ilara's lament, the mysterious composition that had first drawn Adrian from the shadows. But in sleep, Marina heard variations and harmonies that her waking mind could never quite recapture, despite her desperate attempts to transcribe what she remembered upon rising. The dream woman's face remained maddeningly unclear, features shifting like water whenever Marina tried to focus on them directly, but her presence carried a weight of sorrow and longing that made Marina wake with tears on her cheeks and an inexplicable sense of loss for someone she had never known. These visions intensified with each passing night, growing more vivid and emotionally overwhelming until Marina began to fear sleep itself. Terrified of the powerful emotions that awaited her in the realm of dreams, where impossibility seemed to reign supreme. Adrian's attempts to distance himself from Marina proved futile against her razor-sharp perception and intuitive understanding of human behavior patterns, skills honed by years of navigating a world designed for sighted people. She noticed immediately when he began avoiding direct answers to simple questions, when his usual warmth transformed into careful politeness that felt like walls being constructed between them. During their conversations, Marina began cataloging the subtle inconsistencies that had previously escaped her attention in the euphoria of newfound connection. When she asked him to check her appearance in her compact mirror before leaving the hall, claiming concern about her hair being disheveled, Adrian's momentary silence stretched too long before he offered vague reassurances without the specific details a sighted person would naturally provide. She observed that her breath created visible fog in the cold air, while his remained invisible, that he never seemed to eat or drink anything, despite their lengthy conversations that often stretched until dawn threatened the horizon. His knowledge of historical events carried the weight of personal experience rather than academic study, details too specific and emotionally charged to have come from books alone. When Marina finally asked the question directly, her voice cutting through the careful pretense they had both maintained, Adrian's deflection carried none of his usual eloquence. His nervous laughter and attempts at humor only confirmed what her logical mind had already concluded, despite the impossibility of the evidence. That night, alone in her apartment, Marina turned to research with the methodical intensity she had once applied to mastering complex musical compositions. The internet revealed that the Celestial Concert Hall had been built in 1847 by a mysterious patron whose generous donation had funded the entire project before he vanished without explanation, leaving behind only architectural plans signed with the initials A. Dracule. The pieces of an impossible puzzle began arranging themselves in patterns that defied rational explanation. Yet Marina found herself less frightened by the supernatural implications than exhilarated by the prospect of finally understanding the man who had become more important to her than anyone she had ever known. Marina's decision to test her growing suspicions required careful planning and nerves of steel, qualities she had developed through years of independence in a world that often underestimated her capabilities. She arrived at the concert hall an hour before midnight, using the extra time to position a small hand mirror strategically near the piano bench, where Adrian typically materialized from the shadows. The mirror's placement appeared casual, but offered a clear view of anyone approaching the instrument, a trap that would provide definitive proof of the supernatural nature she suspected but hardly dared to believe. When Adrian appeared at the stroke of midnight with his usual punctuality, Marina watched his reflection fail to materialize in the polished surface, while her own image remained clearly visible, the absence of his form in the mirror striking her like a physical blow, despite her mental preparation for this exact revelation. His momentary shock at discovering her trap played across features she could sense rather than see, centuries of careful control shattering like glass against the reality of exposure. The truth hung between them like a blade suspended by the finest thread, dangerous and beautiful and utterly transformative. Marina's voice remained steady as she spoke the words that would change everything, her statement carrying no fear or accusation, but simple acknowledgement of facts that defied everything she had been taught about the nature of reality. Adrian's confirmation came wrapped in desperate pleas for her to flee, to forget him completely, and return to the safety of her ordinary life before the darkness that surrounded him could consume her as well. His begging carried the weight of 3 centuries of accumulated grief. The knowledge that everyone he had ever allowed close to his cursed existence had paid the ultimate price for that proximity. Marina's refusal to abandon him came not from reckless bravery, but from the deeper understanding that some connections transcend the boundaries between mortal and immortal, natural and supernatural. She played for him then a melody of her own composition, notes that seemed to flow directly from her heart through her fingers to the keys. Music that spoke of acceptance without condition, and love that recognized no boundaries. Her words, when they came, carried more power than any supernatural ability he possessed, simple truths that cut through centuries of self-imposed isolation and guilt. She explained that he was the first person in her adult life to see her simply as Marina, not as inspiration or burden or curiosity, not as the blind pianist who overcame obstacles, but as a complete human being worthy of connection and affection. Whatever danger he believed he represented paled in comparison to the threat of returning to the loneliness that had defined her existence before their midnight meetings began. Adrian realized with stunning clarity that Marina feared losing him far more than she feared what he might do to her, that her courage in the face of supernatural revelation stemmed not from ignorance of the risks, but from the understanding that some things were worth any danger, that the connection they had forged in darkness was more precious than the safety found in solitude. The weight of 3 centuries pressed against Adrian's shoulders as he prepared to reveal truths that could destroy the fragile sanctuary they had built together in shadows and music, truths that would transform Marina's understanding of everything she thought she knew about the nature of love and sacrifice. His voice carried the hollow echo of ancient grief as he began the story of his mortal life, when he had been Lord Adrian Dracul, a nobleman whose wealth and influence meant nothing in the face of the plague that swept through Europe like the wrath of an angry god. Elara had been his wife then, a mortal woman whose laughter could fill entire ballrooms and whose gentle songs had been the only thing capable of soothing his restless spirit during the darkest periods of political turmoil. When the plague claimed her, turning her vibrant beauty into wasting sickness that no physician could cure, Adrian's desperation drove him to seek solutions beyond the realm of mortal medicine. The demon he summoned appeared as a creature of impossible beauty and terrible hunger, offering immortality as the price for Alara's salvation, a bargain that seemed generous beyond measure until the full terms became clear. Adrian would indeed live forever. But the curse carried a cruel twist that made his immortality a prison rather than a gift. Everyone he truly loved would die, claimed by fate in increasingly creative and painful ways, while he would be compelled to sustain his unnatural life by drinking the blood of innocents. The demon's laughter had echoed through the candlelit chamber as it explained that love itself would become Adrian's greatest torment, ensuring that his immortal existence would be defined by loss and the constant fear of caring too deeply for any mortal soul. Alara died anyway, not from the plague that had been ravaging her body, but from the horror and shock of witnessing what her beloved husband had become. Her final moments were spent not in gratitude for his sacrifice, but in terror at the monster he had transformed into for her sake. With her dying breath, she sang the lullaby she had composed during their courtship, weaving into its melody a prophecy born of love and desperation. Only when someone could play her song with perfect love and understanding, someone who truly comprehended the depth of sacrifice it represented, would Adrian's humanity have a chance to return. The prophecy carried its own terrible price, for if the curse were successfully broken, Adrian would become mortal again and experience the rapid aging of 3 centuries compressed into mere days, likely dying before the transformation could fully complete. Marina listened to this revelation with growing understanding of why the melody had called to her so powerfully, why her fingers had known every note despite never learning the composition through conventional means. She was not just a pianist who had stumbled upon an ancient song, but potentially the key to either Adrian's salvation or his destruction. The patience that had sustained Countess Elisaveta through centuries of careful political maneuvering finally reached its breaking point when her surveillance network reported that Adrian's mortal had not only discovered his true nature, but had begun researching his historical identity with dangerous thoroughness. The decision to eliminate the threat came with cold calculation rather than passion, executed by enforcers whose loyalty had been tested through decades of bloody service to the Council's will. Marcus Volkov led the assault team that descended upon Marina's apartment building, like shadows given substance and malevolent purpose. Their supernatural speed and strength making them nearly invisible to mortal perception as they scaled fire escapes and bypassed security systems with predatory efficiency. They expected to find a helpless blind woman defenseless in sleep, an easy target whose death could be arranged to look like a tragic accident or random crime. Instead, they discovered evidence that Marina's research had uncovered far more than anyone had realized. Her apartment filled with printouts detailing the Dracul family history, architectural plans of buildings Adrian had commissioned, and financial records that traced his activities across multiple centuries. The vampires realized immediately that she represented not just a security risk, but an active threat to the carefully maintained secret that protected their entire species from discovery and persecution. Marina woke to the sound of her window being forced open with supernatural strength, her enhanced hearing immediately detecting the presence of multiple intruders whose breathing patterns and movement signatures felt wrong in ways her unconscious mind recognized as predatory. Her years of navigating the world through sound and spatial awareness served her well as she rolled from bed and moved toward her predetermined escape route, a path she had mentally rehearsed countless times during the paranoid hours following her discovery of Adrian's true nature. The fire escape became her salvation as she fled into the night, her bare feet finding purchase on metal grating, while enhanced hearing allowed her to track her pursuers' positions with accuracy that surprised even the ancient vampires who had underestimated mortal capabilities. She ran through streets she knew by memory and instinct, seeking the only sanctuary that offered any hope of safety, the concert hall where Adrian would find her no matter what chaos erupted around them. When he materialized from the shadows to discover her bleeding from cuts sustained during her escape, terrified but alive, something fundamental shifted in Adrian's carefully controlled nature. The protective fury that consumed him transcended the hunger that had defined his existence for 3 centuries, transforming him into something that even other vampires feared to face in open combat. His slaughter of 2 enforcers was swift and merciless, centuries of suppressed emotion channeled into violence that painted the concert hall's marble floors crimson. Marcus escaped only because Adrian chose to spare him, sending him back to Elisaveta with a message written in the blood of his fallen comrades. Marina was under Adrian's protection now, and anyone who threatened her would face consequences that defied the political calculations that normally governed vampire society. The declaration of war came with formal ceremony that masked the genuine fear rippling through the vampire hierarchy, for Adrian's defiance represented something unprecedented in their carefully ordered world. No vampire in recorded history had chosen to protect a mortal at the cost of challenging the council's absolute authority, making his rebellion not just personal but philosophical, a rejection of the fundamental principles that had governed their kind since the beginning of recorded supernatural history. Elisavetta's response carried the weight of divine wrath as she declared Adrian rogue and placed blood bounties on both him and Marina that would attract every ambitious vampire in the city, seeking to curry favor with the council through violence. The underground network of safe houses and feeding grounds that had sustained Adrian for centuries became hunting grounds overnight as ancient vampires emerged from their lairs with renewed purpose, the prospect of claiming such prestigious prey awakening predatory instincts that had grown dulled through years of comfortable routine. Adrian's sanctuary lay hidden beneath the city's oldest foundations, a vast underground chamber carved from living rock during an era when the surface world above was still wilderness, populated by indigenous peoples who understood the danger of disturbing certain places. The space reflected 3 centuries of careful curation, walls lined with first edition books whose authors had been dead for generations, musical instruments from every era of human creativity, and artwork that museums would kill to possess if they knew of its existence. Marina moved through this underground palace with wonder that transcended her blindness, her fingers tracing spines of books written in languages that no longer existed, while her ears catalogued the perfect acoustics that made every footstep ring like music. The magnitude of what Adrian had sacrificed for her became clear as she explored his sanctuary, understanding that he had abandoned not just safety, but a lifetime's collection of beauty and knowledge, choosing her welfare over treasures that could never be replaced if lost or destroyed. Her insistence on finding a way to break his curse properly came not from naive optimism, but from the practical recognition that their current situation offered no sustainable future, that they would spend whatever time remained to them as hunted fugitives, unless the supernatural bonds that defined his existence could be severed completely. Ilara's journals, preserved in a climate-controlled case like religious relics, revealed the precise conditions required for the curse's dissolution. The lullaby must be played at the exact moment of a lunar eclipse while the cursed vampire experienced true selfless love, the kind of emotional connection that transcended personal desire and embraced sacrifice as the ultimate expression of devotion. The astronomical calculations that Marina performed with obsessive precision revealed that the next eclipse would occur in exactly 3 days, creating a deadline that would determine whether they faced freedom or destruction, salvation or mutual annihilation in the shadows beneath a world that would never understand the depth of what they meant to each other. The revelation came through whispered rumors that filtered through the supernatural underground like smoke through cracks in ancient stone, reaching Marina through a source she had never expected to find in her ordinary mortal existence. Dr. Sebastian Blackthorne appeared at Adrian's sanctuary during their second day of hiding. His arrival announced by coded knocks that resonated through the chamber with patterns Adrian recognized from decades past. Sebastian moved with the fluid grace that marked him as something more than human, yet less than the full vampires who hunted them, his pale features bearing the aristocratic beauty of his immortal heritage, tempered by the warmth that remained from his mortal mother's bloodline. His introduction carried the weight of scholarly authority earned through decades of research into the metaphysical mechanics that governed supernatural curses, his library of forbidden texts rivaling even the council's carefully guarded archives. Sebastian's explanation of Marina's true nature struck like lightning, illuminating a landscape previously shrouded in darkness, revealing connections that transcended mere coincidence or fate. She was what ancient texts called a soul echo, someone whose spiritual frequency resonated with perfect harmony to another person separated by time and death, a phenomenon so rare that most scholars dismissed it as mythology rather than measurable reality. Marina was not simply a talented pianist who had stumbled upon Alara's composition, but rather the musical reincarnation of Adrian's long-dead wife, carrying within her essence the same creative spirit that had first given birth to the lullaby 3 centuries ago. This revelation explained her instant connection to both the song and Adrian himself, the way her fingers had known melodies she had never learned, and her heart had recognized a love that predated her birth. Sebastian's warnings carried the gravity of someone who had witnessed curse-breaking rituals fail with catastrophic consequences, his half-vampire nature allowing him to understand both mortal and immortal perspectives on the dangers they faced. If the ritual failed, Adrian would not simply remain cursed, but would face the curse's revenge, a supernatural backlash that would destroy him more completely than any physical death. Marina would suffer spiritual annihilation as the mystical forces tore her soul apart in retaliation for attempting to break bonds that had endured for 3 centuries. Meanwhile, Elisavetta's preparations for assault reached their climax as she assembled an army of ancient vampires whose combined age and experience represented the accumulated power of millennia. Her intelligence network had finally located Adrian's sanctuary through painstaking analysis of underground water patterns and seismic anomalies that suggested artificial chambers beneath the city's foundation. The Countess planned her attack to coincide with the lunar eclipse, knowing that Adrian's participation in the curse-breaking ritual would leave him vulnerable and distracted, his supernatural strength diminished by the spiritual energy required to maintain the delicate magical balance necessary for success. Adrian's discovery of Marina's true nature as Alara's spiritual echo plunged him into emotional turmoil that threatened to tear apart his carefully constructed psychological defenses, forcing him to confront feelings he had spent 3 centuries trying to understand and resolve. The knowledge that Marina carried within her the same creative essence that had defined his mortal wife created a crisis of identity and loyalty that no amount of time or experience had prepared him to navigate. He confessed to Marina that loving her felt simultaneously like betraying Alara's memory and discovering a part of his soul he had believed lost forever, as if he were somehow cheating on a ghost while simultaneously honoring the deepest connection of his mortal existence. The philosophical complexity of their situation defied easy resolution, raising questions about the nature of love itself and whether his feelings for Marina represented genuine new affection or merely the supernatural recognition of familiar spiritual patterns. Marina's response demonstrated wisdom that transcended her mortal years. Her understanding of human psychology, sharpened by years of observing behavior through non-visual senses, that often revealed truths hidden from sight. She helped Adrian understand that she was not Alara, returned from beyond death, but someone entirely new, who happened to carry the same musical spirit, that their love existed as its own authentic reality, separate from his historical relationship. The connection they had forged through midnight conversations and shared vulnerability belonged to them alone, not colored by the supernatural circumstances that had brought them together, but built on the solid foundation of mutual understanding and acceptance. Yet even with this emotional clarity, Marina faced an impossible choice that would determine not just their future, but their very survival. She could attempt the curse-breaking ritual, knowing that failure meant death for both of them, Adrian consumed by supernatural revenge, while she suffered spiritual annihilation that would erase her existence more completely than any physical destruction. Alternatively, they could flee together to live as fugitives forever, abandoning any hope of normal life but preserving what they had built in the shadows and stolen moments. Marina's decision came not from reckless courage, but from the deep understanding that some things were worth any risk, that the chance for Adrian's freedom and their mutual salvation outweighed the safety found in perpetual hiding. Their final day together became an intensive preparation for battle on both physical and spiritual planes, Adrian teaching Marina defensive techniques that might help her survive vampire assault, while she practiced the complete version of Alara's song, with all its complex variations and hidden harmonies that Sebastian's research had revealed. The assault began as the first shadow of Earth crossed the lunar surface, Elisavetta's forces descending upon the sanctuary with military precision that spoke of centuries spent perfecting the art of supernatural warfare. Hidden entrances that Marina had never suspected burst open simultaneously as dozens of ancient vampires poured into the chamber like a tide of darkness, given form and murderous intent. The attack shattered the peaceful sanctuary that had sheltered Adrian's treasures for generations. Priceless artifacts crushed underfoot as immortal predators moved with speed that blurred the line between presence and absence. Adrian fought with desperate fury, while Marina struggled to position the piano in the chamber's acoustic center, the only location where the curse-breaking song could achieve the resonant frequency necessary to reach across dimensional barriers and touch the supernatural forces that bound Adrian's fate. The instrument proved impossibly heavy for one person to move, its concert grand frame resisting her efforts as vampire claws and fangs destroyed everything beautiful within reach. Sebastian threw himself into defensive combat with the passionate intensity of someone fighting for ideals rather than mere survival. His half-vampire abilities allowing him to match the ancient predators in speed while retaining enough humanity to care about protecting something beyond himself. He held off multiple attackers even as claws opened wounds that bled with the crimson evidence of his mixed heritage, his sacrifice buying precious time for Marina to complete her preparations. The chamber filled with sounds of supernatural violence as Adrian's 3 centuries of accumulated power met the combined might of vampires, whose individual ages rivaled his own. Furniture splintering and walls cracking under forces that exceeded anything the mortal world typically experienced. Sebastian's mortal wound came as he protected Marina's escape route from a flanking attack, his body crumpling as vampire fangs found the vulnerable junction between neck and shoulder that no amount of supernatural resilience could adequately armor. Adrian realized that conventional combat could not save them as enemies closed from all directions with coordination that spoke of extensive battlefield experience and tactical sophistication. His desperate decision to trigger the sanctuary's ancient defenses created a cave-in that sealed most entrances but trapped them inside with limited air, the weight of centuries-old stone falling like judgment upon the chamber that had been his home and refuge. The eclipse reached totality as Marina finally positioned herself at the piano bench, her fingers finding the keys even as debris rained around them, and the ceiling groaned with structural damage that threatened complete collapse. The curse-breaking ritual had begun in the worst possible circumstances, surrounded by enemies and buried beneath tons of stone, while the astronomical phenomenon that made their attempt possible painted the world above in shades of blood and shadow. The moment Marina's fingers touched the keys as the eclipse reached its zenith, reality itself seemed to bend around the music that flowed from her hands with supernatural certainty, each note carrying power that transcended mere sound to become something approaching divine intervention. Alara's lament erupted from the piano with crystalline perfection, despite the chaos surrounding them, her fingers finding melodies she had never practiced, but knew with the bone-deep certainty of cellular memory, as if centuries of musical knowledge had suddenly awakened within her soul. The song created a barrier of pure harmonic energy that rippled outward from the instrument in visible waves, golden light that held the attacking vampires at bay with force that defied their supernatural strength and speed. Ancient predators who had terrorized mortals for millennia found themselves unable to cross the sonic field that Marina generated, their forms repelled by frequencies that resonated with something fundamentally opposed to their cursed existence. Adrian felt the first stirrings of change as the music washed over him, his immortal flesh beginning to warm with sensations he had not experienced for 3 centuries. dead nerves awakening to register temperature and texture, while his silent heart struggled to remember the rhythm of mortal circulation. The transformation was neither gentle nor gradual, but violent and overwhelming, as if his body was attempting to compress 300 years of suspended humanity into moments of excruciating rebirth. Pain lanced through his chest as his heart convulsed with the effort of beating after centuries of stillness, while his enhanced senses began to dim as supernatural perception gave way to ordinary human limitations. The curse recognized the threat and fought back with malevolent intelligence, sending waves of psychic resistance through the chamber that made the air itself feel thick and hostile to mortal lungs. Yet even as Adrian's vampire strength began to ebb, Elizaveta burst through the fallen stones with the unstoppable force of a natural disaster, her ancient power allowing her to resist the song's protective barrier through sheer force of accumulated will and supernatural authority. The Countess moved through Marina's harmonic shield like a shark cutting through water, her centuries of existence having taught her to endure magical assaults that would destroy younger vampires instantly. Her assault on Adrian began immediately, claws that could rend steel striking with precision, honed through millennia of combat experience, while Marina continued to play, knowing that any interruption in the music would doom them both to fates worse than simple death. The battle between Adrian and Elizaveta raged with supernatural fury, while Marina's music provided the only thing standing between them and complete annihilation, her fingers never faltering despite the violence that erupted mere feet from where she sat exposed and vulnerable. As the ritual progressed toward its climactic moment, Marina began to understand the true nature of the sacrifice required to break bonds that had endured for 3 centuries of supernatural bondage. The curse demanded not death, but something far more precious and personal: the willingness to surrender the aspects of themselves they valued most in service of love that transcended selfish preservation. For Adrian, the sacrifice meant relinquishing not just his immortal strength, but the accumulated power and knowledge that had defined his existence since the night he first became something beyond human limitations. His vampire abilities represented security and control in a world that had taken everything else from him. Yet love for Marina made the choice inevitable, despite the terror of returning to mortal vulnerability after 3 centuries of supernatural protection. For Marina, the sacrifice proved even more complex and heartbreaking, requiring her to surrender the extraordinary musical gifts that had emerged from her blindness and become the defining characteristic of her identity since childhood. Her enhanced hearing and supernatural connection to sound had transformed her disability into something approaching a superpower, allowing her to perceive the world through acoustic dimensions that sighted people could never experience. The curse would accept nothing less than the abilities that made her unique, demanding she choose between the musical talents that had given her purpose and the man she loved more than her own artistic ambitions. Both lovers made their choices simultaneously, Adrian releasing his grip on immortal power, while Marina consciously surrendered the enhanced perception that had shaped her entire approach to existence. The sacrifices began to reshape their fundamental natures as supernatural forces flowed between them like electricity seeking ground, transforming curse energy into something approaching divine grace. Adrian felt his vampire nature dissolving like salt in water, centuries of accumulated darkness leaving his soul, while mortal sensation returned with overwhelming intensity that left him gasping with the shock of rediscovered humanity. Marina experienced the opposite transformation, her supernatural musical abilities fading into ordinary human hearing, while her connection to Adrian deepened beyond anything she had previously imagined possible, their souls intertwining in ways that made individual identity seem almost irrelevant. The curse unleashed its final desperate assault as it felt control slipping away after 3 centuries of absolute dominance, sending psychic attacks that struck like hammers against their consciousness with visions designed to shatter their resolve through pure psychological torture. Adrian saw himself as a monster beyond redemption, witnessed timeline after timeline where his love for Marina brought nothing but destruction and death to everyone they encountered, where his selfish desire for connection turned him into something worse than the demon that had originally cursed him. Marina endured visions of her own horrible death repeated in infinite variations, each scenario showing her torn apart by vampire claws or drained of life, while Adrian watched helplessly, unable to save the woman he claimed to love from the violence that his nature inevitably attracted. The psychic assaults grew more sophisticated and personal, showing them futures where their relationship destroyed Sebastian and countless other innocents, where their love became a plague that spread suffering wherever they went, like some cosmic punishment for daring to challenge supernatural law. Elizaveta recognized their moment of weakness and struck with predatory timing that spoke of centuries spent exploiting human vulnerability, her claws finding the junction between Adrian's neck and shoulder just as the curse began its final dissolution. Immortal blood flowed from wounds that would have healed instantly only moments before, his newly mortal flesh proving as fragile as any human's, despite the power that still coursed through his transforming body. Marina's music transcended technique in that moment of supreme crisis, becoming something that existed beyond mere performance to touch the fundamental frequencies that governed reality itself. Her playing became a song of pure love and grief combined, melody that spoke of loss accepted willingly in service of something greater than individual survival. The sound waves that erupted from the piano carried force that shattered the remaining stone barriers and drove back Elizaveta's surviving forces, ancient vampires retreating before harmonic power that burned their supernatural senses like acid. As Adrian's immortal blood continued to flow away, carrying with it the last vestiges of the curse that had defined his existence for 3 centuries, Marina felt the final barriers between their souls collapse completely. The ritual reached its conclusion not with triumph, but with the terrible knowledge that Adrian was dying as a mortal man. His newly human body, unable to survive the trauma of transformation, combined with wounds that would have been trivial to his vampire constitution, but proved mortal to flesh and blood that had forgotten how to heal at supernatural speed. The eclipse began to wane as Alar's lament faded into silence, leaving them alone in the wreckage of the sanctuary, with freedom purchased at a price that might yet prove too high for either of them to bear. The transformation that should have killed Adrian within moments of its completion instead became something miraculous, as Marina's sacrificed abilities transformed into healing power that flowed through the broken curse like water finding its natural course. 3 centuries of accumulated time pressed against his newly mortal frame with crushing weight, threatening to age him into dust before he could draw his first truly human breath. Yet the mystical energy released by Marina's willing sacrifice wrapped around his failing body like a protective cocoon. Her enhanced musical perception had not simply vanished, but had transformed into something far more precious, a healing force that recognized his desperate need and responded with the same instinctive precision that had once allowed her to navigate the world through sound alone. The curse, fully shattered after centuries of absolute control, released not just Adrian from its supernatural bondage, but also every fragment of life force it had stolen from its countless victims over the long years of his immortal existence. This accumulated energy, freed from the demonic bonds that had twisted it into sustenance for his vampiric nature, flowed back into Adrian with the rushing force of a dam bursting, stabilizing his mortality while leaving him weak but genuinely human, for the first time since that terrible night 3 centuries ago when desperate love had led him to make a bargain with darkness itself. Marina felt her own transformation as a profound shift in the way she experienced the world around her, her supernatural connection to sound fading into the ordinary human hearing that most people took for granted. Yet she discovered that her music remained beautiful, even without the mystical enhancement that had defined her artistic identity since childhood. Her playing now carried the warmth of human emotion rather than supernatural perfection, technique grounded in years of practice rather than metaphysical gifts. And she found this change brought its own form of satisfaction that felt more authentic than anything she had experienced during her years of enhanced perception. Elisaveta surveyed the wreckage of the sanctuary with calculating eyes, her ancient mind already processing the implications of what had just transpired before her. The vampire king she had sought to destroy had indeed been reduced to mortal status, his supernatural power dissolved into nothing more threatening than human fragility and ordinary lifespan. Her enemy no longer possessed the strength or influence to challenge the council's authority, making continued pursuit a waste of resources that could be better applied to more pressing threats to vampire security. With cold pragmatism that had sustained her through centuries of political maneuvering, the Countess withdrew her surviving forces from the ruins of Adrian's sanctuary, considering the matter closed with his transformation into something too weak to merit further attention from immortal powers. 6 months of mortal life proved both challenging and revelatory for Adrian and Marina, as they navigated the complex process of building a relationship free from supernatural complications, but grounded in the deep connection they had forged during their time in darkness and danger. Adrian's vast accumulated wealth, gathered across 3 centuries of careful investment and acquisition, provided the foundation for a new life purpose that felt both practical and profoundly meaningful. His purchase of the abandoned Celestial Concert Hall surprised the city's real estate community, but his plans for renovation exceeded every expectation as he transformed the crumbling venue into a state-of-the-art music school designed specifically for disabled children who had been overlooked by traditional educational institutions. Marina found her calling as a piano instructor whose personal experience with disability gave her unique insight into the challenges faced by students who navigated the world through senses other than sight. Her teaching methods adapted to accommodate learning differences that mainstream music education rarely addressed with adequate sensitivity or understanding. Adrian handled the business aspects of their enterprise with efficiency honed through centuries of managing complex financial affairs, his experience with human nature and institutional politics proving invaluable as he secured funding and regulatory approval for their ambitious educational project. Their relationship deepened through the simple joy of working toward shared goals that benefited others. Love expressed through daily cooperation and mutual support rather than dramatic gestures or supernatural intensity. Adrian discovered that mortality brought gifts he had never anticipated, each day precious precisely because it was limited. Each moment with Marina valuable beyond measure because their time together was finite rather than endless. Marina learned to find satisfaction in sharing her musical knowledge, rather than hiding her talents in empty halls, her students' progress providing fulfillment that surpassed any applause she had received during her brief professional career. The vampire world gradually moved on from the events that had shattered the council's authority, Adrian's story becoming a cautionary tale told in whispers among immortals who struggled to understand how anyone could voluntarily surrender the power and security that defined their existence. Sebastian recovered from his wounds with the resilience of his mixed heritage, visiting occasionally to check on their progress and provide updates on supernatural politics that no longer directly affected their lives, but remained a source of curiosity for those who had once been intimately involved in such matters. Adrian and Marina discovered that some bonds transcended the supernatural circumstances that had brought them together, their love proving stronger as ordinary mortals than it had ever been when complicated by curses and power imbalances that had made their relationship as much about salvation as affection. The anniversary of the curse breaking found Marina and Adrian returning to the concert hall at midnight, not from compulsion or supernatural obligation, but from the simple human desire to commemorate a moment that had transformed their lives in ways both profound and practical. Marina approached the piano that had become the centerpiece of their music school, her fingers finding the keys with the familiarity of countless hours spent teaching young students to find their own voices through melody and rhythm. She began to play Alara's Lament one final time, but the song that emerged carried none of the desperate longing that had once defined its every note, instead flowing with gratitude and peaceful resolution that spoke of healing completed and love fulfilled. Adrian joined her at a second piano they had installed for duet instruction, his playing complementing hers with harmonies that filled the renovated hall with hope instead of the ancient sorrow that had once echoed through its empty spaces. Their music together created something entirely new while honoring the melody that had brought them together, a composition that belonged to their present rather than Adrian's tragic past or Marina's lonely years before they had found each other. As they played, neither noticed the translucent figure that appeared in the balcony where Adrian had once hidden in shadow, Ilara's spirit manifesting with the gentle radiance of someone finally released from earthly concerns. She watched her husband play with joy rather than grief, witnessed him discover love that honored their past while embracing a future she could never share, and smiled with the profound satisfaction of someone whose final earthly duty had been completed with grace and wisdom. Her whispered blessing settled over them like benediction before her spirit faded into the peaceful rest she had been denied for 3 centuries. Her own curse of watching over Adrian finally ended by his discovery of happiness that no longer required her protective presence. Marina finished the song and turned toward Adrian with movements guided by ordinary human senses rather than supernatural perception. Yet she could hear his heartbeat with perfect clarity, feel the warmth radiating from his mortal body, sense his presence beside her with intimacy that required no mystical enhancement to feel complete and satisfying. They left the hall hand in hand as they had so many times before, but tonight their departure felt like the conclusion of one chapter and the beginning of another, ready to face whatever challenges or joys the future might hold, as two ordinary people who had found extraordinary love in circumstances that most would consider impossible. 5 years after their transformation from supernatural beings to mortal lovers, the Celestial Concert Hall hosted its first major public performance since reopening, a benefit concert for the Marina Blackwood Foundation for Musical Education that had become one of the city's most respected charitable organizations. Marina took the stage with her student orchestra, young musicians whose various disabilities had never prevented them from discovering the profound joy that music could bring to lives often limited by society's narrow expectations of what constituted normal ability or acceptable difference. Adrian watched from the wings with pride that transcended any emotion he had experienced during his centuries of immortal existence, their wedding ring catching the stage lights as he applauded with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that true wealth lay not in accumulated power or supernatural abilities, but in the simple human connections that gave meaning to ordinary life. The audience filled every seat in the renovated hall, dozens of children and their families celebrating achievements that traditional music education might never have recognized or fostered, their applause creating a symphony of appreciation that would have moved even the most jaded observer to tears of recognition and hope. The vampire king, who had once haunted empty halls in desperate loneliness, had become a man who filled those same spaces with joy and purpose. His transformation complete not just in the supernatural sense, but in the deeper recognition that meaning came through service to others, rather than the pursuit of personal power or immortal security. In the music that surrounded them, flowing from instruments played by young hands that had found their voices through patient instruction and adaptive techniques. Ilara's lullaby echoed faintly like a blessing woven into the fabric of sound itself, no longer a curse binding the living to the dead, but a gentle reminder that love could transcend death and time to bring healing to those brave enough to embrace its transformative power. The concert concluded with standing ovations and tears of joy from parents who had watched their children discover abilities they never knew they possessed. While Marina and Adrian stood together, knowing that their greatest magic had been learning that love required no supernatural enhancement to work miracles in the ordinary world of human hearts and mortal dreams.